When it comes to painting Death Guard, I find that they are an excellent army to apply lots of weathering to. So today I'm painting the Pallid Hand sub-faction of Death Guard, and I'll be showing you my methods for applying battle damage and rust. To begin with, I'm using Vallejo Khaki Grey over a black primer, and all I'm doing with this is creating a nice solid layer over the top using an airbrush. However, you don't need an airbrush for this, you can use just a regular paintbrush. I'm just using an airbrush more for speed. Once that layer is dried, I then move over to Iraqi sand and just do a layer over the top, trying to keep the previous layer in the recesses and in the shaded areas. I'm not too fussed about getting this over any of the other parts of the model, just because I'm going to be painting black over the top of them in just a moment. For the last part of the main armor, I am using pale sand, and all I'm doing is just making a nice thin layer over the top of the previous layers. I'm trying to keep this on the majority of the higher points of the armor and on some of the mid sections. Once the armor's been covered, I then move to blocking in all the other colored areas. Now, I hate painting over white and like quite bright colors, so I block it all in with black. This can be a step to skip, but I tend to do it just because I find it easier and I find it nicer just to paint over black. That does mean you have to take some care when you are blocking in, as you don't want to go over the previous armor that we just painted. Next up, I'm painting the green, and for this I'm using Militia Green by Army Painter War Paints, and I'm doing the shoulder pads and the cloth and cape. For the shoulder pads, I'm doing it in a particular way. For everything else, I'm just blocking it in. But for the shoulder pads, what I do is I dilute it quite heavily, and then I basically stipple it on, but I build it up in a way where all the paint pigments is towards the light, or where you want the light to be. And you can make quite a cool effect of this by having like a dull, like in the shadows sort of area, and then with the other paint you'll build on top of that and do exactly the same technique, and at the end it will look quite grungy and pretty cool. If you're enjoying this video, then don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Once that's dry, I then move on to the brighter color, and I'm using medium olive green. I wanted these greens to be quite desaturated, and for the final one I wanted it to be fairly bright, but I'm doing the exact same technique. I'm basically just stippling on or dabbing on the paint and having it very heavily watered down. And again, you want to be putting the highlights where the light will be hitting the most. For the last part of the main shoulder pad, I am using lime green, and I'm doing exactly the same technique yet again. And this should build the brightness up like quite high, and it will look really nice. You can see how translucent the paint is that I'm applying, and you can sort of see the brightness of that compared to the other shoulder pad. For the cape, I'm leaving that brightness at olive green, and then we'll be doing something extra with that in just a moment. So for the cape, I've just solidly based it in olive green, and all I'm going to be doing with the Militia Green is doing some glazes in sort of some of the recessed areas. I'm not doing any highlights on this at the moment, but we will be getting some more definition to that in just a second. Now I'm just going to be going over all the bone areas, and I'm just basing it all with Rakar flesh. I'm just making a solid layer over the top. I'm not going to be doing too much of this. I'm probably just going to be doing a layer of Skeleton Horde over the top of that, as I want all the emphasis on the armor and on the weathering, as I want this to be a quickish scheme that is for tabletop. Next up is the trim, and I wasn't initially going to do this at this stage, but then I just decided just to do it, and I'll do all the weathering together. So for this, I'm literally just using decayed metal, scale 75, and just doing a nice solid base coat over all of the like sort of coppery, bronzy areas. Next, I am starting the silvers, and for this I'm doing a rust effect, so I'm using a rust primer, which is AK's rust primer. If you don't have this, you can easily just use a reddish sort of browny colour, and I'm just base coating all of the places where I want to have silver. Once that's dried, I then got a dry brush and I started with Iron Warriors. I like the darkness of the Iron Warriors silver. I don't think it's the best, but if you have any other sort of dark metallic that you want to use, then go ahead and use that. But all I'm doing is dry brushing over that rust primer. Next up, I'm just doing some highlights on the armor, which I'm just using pale sand for. You don't have to do this part just yet, but I am doing it just so I can blend in some of the highlights and make them look a bit more grimy. You can skip this part just to make it a little bit quicker, because you will be doing a little bit in a little while. Next, I'm just throwing some skeleton horde over the Rakar flesh on all the bone areas. Just doing it really quickly, there's nothing too special about this step. Next up, I'm just painting all the little worms or leeches, whatever they are, over him, and I'm just using a magenta for this. I'm not really doing too much. I won't be highlighting it, I'm just throwing them on there. I think it's a bit of a bright colour and it sort of contrasts quite a lot with it, and I kind of wish I used a different colour for it, but I mean, it's fine. Next, I'm just doing the lenses. I'll put a link in the description for another video where I go into the lenses a bit more in depth. For the next step, we are just throwing over a ton of, I'm using dark brown wash, however you can also use the streaking grime, you can use sort of any sort of like wash, enamel wash that you want, and the way this works is you put it all over the model so it gets in all the recesses and things, and it covers it and tints it, and then we remove it all, or we remove the majority of it. You can do this over a varnish, however you don't have to. So to remove it, I use these small little makeup brushes and white spirit. So all I do is dab the makeup brushes in the white spirit, and then I'm just gently going over all of the places where I put this wash, and I'm just removing all the excess. These little makeup brushes have been amazing, and they're super soft, so they don't damage any of the paintwork. That's why I haven't done any varnishing beforehand. However, if you're not using these, I would recommend using a varnish if you're not using a soft-ish sort of material. And it's completely up to you how much you remove or how much you keep on. I like to keep a little bit of it on, but I mostly use it for like a sort of tint. And to keep going with the weathering, I am now using Dirty Down Rust, and I'm just putting that all over the silver metallic areas, and I'm basically just dabbing this over and then using water just to like move it around and hopefully get some different sort of tints of rust. To further continue the weathering, I am now letting the Dirty Down dry, and I've started doing some sponging of a dark brown. Now I used German Sea Black Brown, however Rhinox Hide is a great alternative. For this, all I've done is ripped off a little bit of sponge, and I'm just dabbing over sort of all the hard edges and some little areas. And another thing I like to do is to sort of dab and swipe in some locations to look like it's been scratched. Next, I'm just adding a little bit of OSL to the Man Reaper. Since it's a power weapon, I'm just adding some green ink into like where the little orb is, and I'm just treating that little crack bit as a sort of glowing area. While the ink is drying, I then go to the metallics again, and I start doing a few highlights. I'm using scale 75 Necro Gold, and I know it's not bronze or brass, but I just really like this colour, and I kind of like it over the sort of dark bronzy brass colour. So if you wanted to stick with like the bronze sort of colourway for Death Guard, then I would highly suggest going maybe like a Sycorax bronze or a Rune Lord brass and stick with them sort of colours. But for this, all I'm sort of doing like a stippling kind of motion. I'm not really doing any sort of edge highlights. I think on some like raised areas I am, but I'm just sort of dabbing all over the metallics to give like a sort of battered feeling. Once that ink is dried, I'm then coming in with a little bit of fluorescent paint. However, this time instead of going straight fluorescent, I'm adding a little bit of luminous green as well as the fluorescent. So to continue on with the rust, I'm using Galvanic Corrosion by Vallejo, and it's a special effects paint, and I'm using this with a fluorescent orange. Now what I do with this is I use quite a lot of Galvanic Corrosion. It creates quite a nice darkish sort of orange, and then all I do with the fluorescent paint is I get a tiny drop of it and just dab it in wherever the Galvanic Corrosion is sitting, and sometimes in like the deepest recesses, but it gives like a really nice sort of like bright orangey look to it, because not all rust is dull, some of it's super bright, and that is basically why I include the fluorescent orange. Now to go back to the armour, I am going back with the pale sand, and the reason why I'm going back to the pale sand and not a brighter colour is because since the wash was added, it darkens the main colour and sort of tints it, so the pale sand can just be used as a highlight to highlight already darkened pale sand. Now with this, all I'm doing is going around sort of all the locations where I sponged on that dark brown. I'm sort of doing like an outline and some little dots and then some little scratches with with the paintbrush. You want to make sure that you've got like quite a fine tipped paintbrush to do this, and so you can create like these little lines and dots. And this is one of the reasons why I said not to really bother with any of the highlights, because you're pretty much doing highlights right now, and you can still do the highlights right now. It's just I wanted to have like some highlights, but then just dim down a little bit. For the final steps, I'm just then dry brushing Iron Warriors over the top of all the rusted effects that we've done. This will just re-establish some of that silver that we lost from all the rust that we added. For the last step, I'm weathering the bronze areas, and I'm just using a dark blue pale by Vallejo. This is a bit of an experiment from me. I usually use Nailac Oxide from Citadel, but I figured I'd try something a bit different, and I've just watered this down heavily, and then I'm just sort of dabbing at bronze areas and just like wicking away any excess that I don't want. I did find it was a little bit too much, so I did have to go back over with some decayed metal and just add some of that bronzeness back in. Once you've done with the dry brushing, I then get fresh metal by scale 75. You can use any sort of brighter silver metallic, and then I'm just dabbing on the brush and then just stippling it on and just creating like little scratches and marks over the silver metallic area. With the final step of the tutorial finished, then you should have a pretty cool model to put on the tabletop. If you like this video, then please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps me out tremendously. I do have a further in-depth rust tutorial which I will display now. If you want any further in-depth tutorials about anything, then please just let me know. I have a whole range of models that need to be painted, so I'm more than happy to do that, and it'll be worked on as a priority. Again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.